This episode of Fermented Adventure the Podcast features Calum Leslie of Spearhead Whisky. Haven't heard of Spearhead Whisky? Listen to this episode and learn about this tremendous Scotch whiskey. Be sure to reach out to Calum and Spearhead and let them know what you thought about the podcast. Cheers! Hello, ladies and gentlemen, craft spirit enthusiasts, and those interested in the intoxicating world of craft distilleries, cideries, meaderies, wineries, and the occasional foray into breweries. It's Rich Shane, and welcome to Fermented Adventure, the podcast, where we bring you the fascinating people that are making the mash, fermenting, distilling, bottling, pouring, and delivering to you some of the finest libations in the world. Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping items. Thank you for bringing the podcast into wherever you are and whatever you're doing. We truly are grateful that you have chosen to listen and make us part of your day. It would mean the world to us if you left a 5-star review. This helps us climb in the rankings, and it makes it easier for others to find us. Don't hesitate to leave us your comments as well. If the podcast didn't meet your expectations, tell us why. We're always striving to improve. You can find us at fermentedadventure.com. We are on Instagram and Facebook as Fermented Adventure. Email us at fermentedadventure@gmail.com. All right, FA Nation, let's meet our guest. He's Calum Leslie. I'm Rich Shane. This is Fermented Adventure, the podcast. Calum, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Rich, how you doing? Delighted to be here.
Well, we haven't seen each other since Bar Convent, Brooklyn, and we came across this booth with Spearhead, and this whiskey just created this wonderful experience. And then meeting you and learning about Spearhead, it just elevated the experience for us. For those that have not heard of Spearhead Whisky, what is it?
Yeah, so Spearhead Whisky in a nutshell is 100% malted barley, single grain. We distill in a coffey style still, we mature in ex-bourbon, and then we finish in infrared toasted virgin American oak to get a spirit that's sweet, light, and super approachable for a Scotch whiskey.
All right, now you said something key that I really honed in on. Infrared virgin oak.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds like this very technical process of what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So we're the only people in Scotch to use infrared toasting. I believe it's used in the US in the wine industry, and it's used in some spirits. So I think makers use it for Makers 46. But essentially what it allows us to do is pinpoint finer characteristics in the wood. So when those sugars caramelize, you get this real level of like velvety sweetness. It varies from traditional toast where you get more of a nutty style of sweetness. So actually what we do when we finish Spearhead is we use 30% infrared toasting with 2 different toast profiles that are chosen to optimize that sweetness level. We use 70% traditional toast, again with another 2 different toast profiles. And then to make things even more complex, from the entire batch, 50% is finished in first fill for 3 months, and 50% is finished in second fill for 6 months. And then we vat the 2 together. So it's quite a long, complex finishing process, but it just gives us that level of sweetness that we were really looking for.
How did this idea to do this come about? As you said, you may be the only Scotch distillery doing this right now. What was the impetus for trying this and creating this wonderful spirit that you're making?
Sure, yeah. So I joined Loch Lomond end of 2019. I came in as head of innovation, and I was really tasked with looking at the portfolio that we have and kind of working out what's next from a brand point of view. So, if you look at Loch Lomond Group's portfolio, we've been around for a couple hundred years. We've got Loch Lomond as a single malt, which is that credible challenger to the Glens. We've got another phenomenal single malt brand called Glen Scotia, which is like a malt whiskey explorer brand. We've got various different blended brands that are high volume, lower value. And for me, the one thing that was missing was that recruitment style of Scotch whiskey. As we all know, Scotch can be a little bit more difficult to get into. So I wanted to create a whiskey that really brought more people into the category. I started looking at, who could we recruit? That was like Irish whiskey drinkers, where the whiskey is a little bit lighter than Scotch or smoother. American whiskey, or specifically bourbon, where it's a little bit sweeter. So with that in mind, we looked at the tools and capabilities that we have at the distillery, starting with 100% malted barley. We then use a 92-hour fermentation process to get all those super fruity characteristics coming through. And at this stage, it's the exact same as all our other different single malts. but there it varies, where we distill in a coffey style still. So a coffey style still is continuous, and you get that element of lightness that's similar to Irish whiskey. But at that stage, you can no longer call it single malt because it's distilled continuously and not in batches. But it opens up a whole load of other opportunities, like different grain types and quality within single grain. So definitely the right call to get that lightness. We then mature it in ex-bourbon, and we finish it the way that we've just talked about to get that level of sweetness. So it really is designed to be that sweet, light, approachable style of whiskey that gets more people into the category.
Pardon the interruption. Thank you so much for listening to Fermented Adventure, the podcast. Could you do us a favor? Hit that follow button. It makes it easier for others to find us, and it helps us climb in the rankings. Take a screenshot of the podcast, post it, tag us, and let everyone know that you listen to the Fermented Adventure podcast. Now, back to our podcast. You know, you talk about, and you've said it a number of times, sweet, light, and approachable. People think of Scotch whiskey and the history and the romance of it. But what is it in your industry right now where you feel that you need to create something to draw or to develop a new consumer?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many pros to Scotch whiskey as a whole. I mean, you know, arguably one of the best categories or products in the world to market Scotland, and just that appeal, and, you know, it's got that romantic look and feel about whiskey. But I think, you know, all the positives of tradition also bring some negatives, because there's so many rules about how you can drink Scotch whiskey, right? You know, drink it neat, it can't be mixed with anything. You can maybe add a little bit of water. And what that's done is it's kind of put off a new audience of people coming into the category because they feel that they can't mix it or they can't enjoy it in different ways. So with Spearhead, we talk about being the whiskey that does things differently. Everything from the inputs that we just talked about with the malted barley, the coffey still, the infrared barrels, through to the output of the style of liquid, the drink strategy, which I'm sure we'll talk about, to where you discover it is different. So I feel that, you know, us as a brand and as a category just needed that little bit of thinking outside the box to do things differently to try and draw more people in.
See, this is why we had that bar convent experience together, and we're outside, and there's a ton of people coming in and out of your booth, and a lot of them had that same, you know, look on their face that we probably did when we approached you. You know, what is Spearhead? How come I haven't heard of this before? What's going on? And, you know, you really talk about that innovative idea or that innovative personality. For you, what was your bar convent experience like?
You know, so I'd been to Berlin, so BCB in Berlin. Out there, I've been to a ton of spirits festivals around the world. I thought, you know, in Brooklyn specifically, the level of energy that people brought when they came to the booth was that next level. It was super cool to experience. I think the majority of people who approached our booth were excited to try something different, and they had an open mind, which I think was super important. So for me, it was a great couple of days where we could really showcase the best of what we can do with the liquids. We had our kind of wheel of fortune where people could get different items of merch, which was awesome. The serves that we had a spritzer style of serve, so it fit the occasion and the weather, which is a lot different from Scotland, right? So it's cold and rainy all year round here. So that fit well as well. But it was the thing that really kind of blew me away was just that level of excitement and that open-mindedness that people brought to bar convent, and also just the activations after the daily sessions were cool. So we went along to a couple of the grants activations, which were great. So it was really cool to see that and experience that over in Brooklyn.
You come to this from your own experience of whiskey. Talk about how you really got into whiskey, or how it became something that was interesting for you.
Sure. So I grew up in Scotland. I've been around whiskey pretty much.
That explains the accent. That really does.
Sure. I took a little bit of a different path into the world of whiskey, actually. I studied law at school. And the third year of law school, I spent in Austin, Texas. So over there, I took a class called Law, Business and Innovation. And the professor that ran it was Adam Dell, so brother of Michael Dell from Dell Computing. And I became obsessed with, the idea of running my own business. I'd sort of, with his guests that came in every week, I'd kind of ask a bunch of questions. I thought, okay, when I go back to Scotland, I'd like to run my own thing. So got back to Scotland, graduated. I set up a technology business actually at the time. So this is 2012. It was at the point where Instagram had just been sold to Facebook. Snapchat was on the rise. We had a creative decision-making tool that we launched that ended up getting backed by Microsoft. I moved down to London. We did Dragon's Den, which is the UK equivalent of Shark Tank. We're in a Hollywood movie. So I kind of got that understanding of how to build a business. I moved back up to Scotland and we ended up selling that off to a development company. And I was working out what to do next. And I took a little bit of a break on the Isle of Mull. So my dad and I went along to Tobermory Distillery. And at that point, I'd been around whiskey, but wasn't really, I never really got into it properly. So we went around the distillery, we sat down, and in the end, they did a tasting, and they had two sort of flagship products that they put in front of us. One was Tobermory 10-year-old, and the second one was Lechaig, their peated version. I tried the 10-year-old, it was like, still tastes like whiskey, not quite into that yet. And I tried the Lechaig, and I was blown away. I thought that's exactly the style of whiskey that I could get into. So I went from Lechaig to Laphroaig, Lagavulin, Talisker, anything peated was my kind of game at the start. Then started to migrate into Speyside, some lowlands. I set up a whiskey subscription company, really just for educational purposes, to start buying whiskey and sending it out to people. And one thing materialized into another, where I had a concept for my own whiskey brand. And fortunately for me, a friend of mine had just sold his tech company to PayPal at the time, was looking to fund other startups. So he ended up backing my whiskey company. I grew it for 3 years. Was chatting to the guys at Loch Lomond Group, and they said, hey, how would you fancy coming in and joining us and helping us build out some of our brands? And that was the kind of step into there. So a little bit of a different path into Scotch whiskey, but it's been a fun journey so far.
What is it? You mentioned the peatiness of the whiskey, and you're in an environment where whiskey's whiskey. I mean, it's almost look, it's water of life, right? Yeah. It's there every day, but it sounds like it wasn't something as a family that, it was a cultural thing. It's in your world, but it wasn't like something that really hooked you in until later.
Yeah, for sure. I think what it is everyone in Scotland seems to have that sort of experience when you're younger where, you steal the bottle of blended or single malt from your dad's cupboard. You probably drink a little bit too much of it and you put off for a little bit. So that definitely happens to, I think, every kid in Scotland at some point. So I was kind of put off the smell and the notion of whiskey a little bit. And I think, to be honest, what it was because peated whiskey didn't taste like a kind of your average blended whiskey or a Speyside or a Lowland. And it was that flavor profile that kind of hooked me and brought me into the world. So I think I did it differently from most people where, you would normally, certainly if I was giving advice to someone to get into the world of Scotch, I'd start with, something like an easy Lowland, something quite grassy and, with not much weight or certainly non-peated, maybe move into some of the Speysides where you've got a lot more, rich characteristics coming through. You've got that wine barrel finish or port or sherry, and then into the Isle of whiskies. But I kind of did it backwards, and I think it was just based on that experience when I was younger. I wanted something different, and hey, it worked because now I'm hooked.
It's like that curveball that never breaks but hits the plate anyway. And
sure.
Baseball reference for us. I've been nosing this, and what I've really enjoyed is I didn't open the bottle until I wanted to wait until we sat down to speak. It's bringing me back to that first experience that we had together. And there's so much citrus on the nose, so much floral on the nose. There's a spicy component to this. Now, this is, for all intents and purposes, this is your baby. As you kind of go through, and I haven't, done a tasting yet right now, but just the nose, what is it after all the experience, and this is really something as a flagship for you? What is it you're searching for that you want to have for, you want that customer, that drinker to have that experience through just enjoying Spearhead? Yeah,
sure. So I think certainly when we look at characteristics, this is non-traditional. So on the nose for me, I get a lot of those floral notes as well. Certainly some kind of citrus punch. There's that background of dark fruits almost. But for me, instantly, the first time I nosed Spearhead, I almost got bourbon characteristics. So it's like the fresh cut wood, a little bit of vanilla. And it just instantly screamed out that this is a whiskey that's different and a little bit more approachable. I think that's kind of carried through on the palate. So you get that sweetness that comes through. And really, it just is designed to be that easygoing. So the experience we want anyone to have with Spearhead and everyone to have is, drink it the way you want. You don't have to consume it neat. We've got a bunch of different serves that we recommend you mix up Spearhead in different styles that are based on occasion and out with that. Certain styles are neat, but it's super important that everyone approaches it in their own way, and that they feel that they can play around with Spearhead a little bit if they want to do that.
What really comes out and what I'm thinking about as I'm tasting this, I'm just wondering, as you're speaking about the character of the nose and the experience you want people to have, wanting to just tour with you the distillery and getting a sense of what this liquid tastes like before it hits those infrared, that infrared system that you set up to see how that changes the characteristic of the whiskey. And I'm sure as you've done and developed and tasted that, it's been fascinating for you to see how that imparts the vanillins and the toastiness into what this becomes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Loch Lomond as a distillery is known to be a super innovative distillery. As I mentioned, we've been around for like 200 years. The current site was built in 1965, and we introduced something called straight neck pot stills. It was actually a really enterprising American guy called Duncan Thomas who owned Loch Lomond at that point, and he created the straight neck pot still. So it's kind of similar to a traditional pot still, but it's got a rectifying column on the top. And what that does is it allows us to take the spirit off at different cut points. So we've got a narrow cut, which is 90 down to 80 ABV, taking it off the receiver at 85. We've then got the wide cut, which is 80 down to 55, off the receiver at 65. And so we get a huge amount of flavor in all our individual spirits. Partner that with the fact that we've got an extended fermentation time of 92 hours. We produce 11 different styles of malt whiskey at Loch Lomond Group Distillery, which is unique because when you look at the majority of distilleries in Scotland, they produce two, peated and unpeated. So for me with Spearhead, although we're not using that straight neck pot still, the coffey still is a super innovative still that no one else in Scotland has either. That continuous distillation, and it was really important that Spearhead had its own character and could stand out in a portfolio with so many strong individual whiskies. So before it hits those barrels, you get the fruit character. So certainly those dark fruits. I think you get the blackcurrant, the cranberry maybe, but you don't get nearly as much of the sweetness. And it's that real level of sweetness that those infrared barrels are imparting. So I think on the palate, you get, it's almost like vanilla fudge or like brown sugar. And then when you swallow the finish on the whiskey, is that like melted brown sugar. It's just all day long. It's a long finish and it just keeps evolving with sweetness, which I think is perfect.
I am so glad I'm tasting while you're explaining, because it's almost as if you're standing over my shoulder while we're looking at a map on how we want to get from one place to another. And you're pointing out, hey, we're going to stop here and then we're going to go here. And as you're talking about some of those tasting notes that start to come into this whiskey, I'm like, oh yeah, we arrived here. That's pretty cool. My first experience today, when you nose this, I get a thinner nose. There's not a high amount of ethanol in here. It's not a high proof whiskey. It's very approachable. My mind says it's going to be a thinner mouthfeel. And the first thing that really you get is a wonderful experience is there's a tremendous amount of viscosity here. It coats your whole tongue. It allows you to, the whiskey to hit different places on your mouth, which then gives you the ability to take that journey to those different flavor places that Spearhead provides.
For sure, yeah, absolutely. And we bottled it at 43, at 86 proof, because the conversation around ABV was one that we pondered for a while. We do everything at Loch Lomond based on flavor. Our single malts are 46% unless they're multiple retail, where we bump it down to 40 ABV. But with Spearhead, it is positioned at being a bartender's whiskey, right? We want to introduce, and we have introduced that into the on-trade with a focus on the on-trades. Putting Spearhead at 40% would have been the easy choice to make as the entry-level style of whiskey, but we wanted a Scotch that stood out more in cocktails. So bumping that up just by 3% makes a huge difference. And I think that really comes through in the mouthfeel as well. It's got that real weight of character that, definitely approachable, but it's doing a lot in there with that vanilla, light brown sugar, the apple notes, a touch of citrus, and a little bit of floral notes that really give you a whiskey that is truly special.
I also believe, from my experience, if you don't like peat, this is a good entry point to see the value that peat brings to a Scotch. If you do like peat, it satisfies your desire to have those smoky notes that come out. And I think that what's imparted in the wood, the tannins, you get that wonderful, you're drinking something that really had that bourbon in there. Those characteristics do get imparted here. Like I said, it's such a wonderful journey to satisfy a number of people that are, all right, I've had this, I've had the 15, the 20, the 30. I'm just looking for that, longevity of something that was into a barrel. But then this comes along, and this whole innovation thing, it almost appears that you guys are the rebels on the block. It's almost like, all right, what happens if we, just take this and we put, like this, 500, horsepower engine into this little tiny Mini, right? And see what the car can do. That seems to be what you're doing with Spearhead. What is the receiving? What have you received? What's the, the response been in Scotland, first of all, to what you're bringing to the table?
Do you know, I always say the hardest place in the world to sell Scotch is Scotland. It's, it's a competitive market. It's difficult. And, being the home market, it's a market that we have to invest in and do invest in heavily through activations and a bunch of stuff that we do. In Scotland, some of my favorite places to drink Spearhead, places like Nauticus, that's down in Leith in Edinburgh, where it's a modernized Scotch bar. So you get that old school kind of pub feel, but at the same time, they do world-class cocktails, and you can drink Spearhead, as we call it, a spear in a beer. Just we pair it up, right? So it's basically a half a Spearhead and a half a lager. Or you can experience it in a Clover Club, which is, a pink, fluffy, unexpected style of drink that's just so different from anything within the world of Scotch. So I think in Scotland, bartenders have really picked up and started to run with it. Another venue is called Hoot the Redeemer, where they put it in slushies. So, putting Scotch in slushies is something I don't think they've done before, but because of the character and nature of Spearhead, they could run with that. So Scotland was definitely and still remains to be a tough market to crack. Internationally, the response has been phenomenal. Europe, markets like Poland. I was out in Poland a couple of weeks ago. We're at a bar show called Better Bar Show. And just the excitement for new products, especially in the world of Scotch, was amazing to see, actually. I'd put that on the same level as the States. Coming over to Brooklyn, that trip I did New York, I did California, we did LA and Vegas for the San Francisco Spirits competition. And it was just awesome just to get the product out there and see how people were reacting with it. So Scotland first and then the rest of the world. We're now 26 countries around the world and growing, 5 states in the US. So it's taken some time, but we'll get there.
You said something very interesting to me that has created a lot of just thought and a question. We interviewed Ghost Ice System, and similar to what you're doing, it seems like you're introducing a product to the bartenders first. You want to take care of the bartenders. And is that the philosophy, that word of mouth will come from what bartenders create, bartenders excite, bartenders innovate to the public, versus a lot of brands that want to introduce to the public first? And is that part of just, this is what I do. This is, Calum, this is, you're on the Dragon's Den. This is the innovation side. Is this a mindset also that you find that if you direct yourselves to the bartenders, that the consumer will come?
Absolutely. The approach that we've taken with Spearhead from day one is let's focus almost exclusively on the on-trade, and the off-trade will come. I think if you look at spirits brands, great spirits brands, they were built in the on-trade first. It's getting the back into the bartender. The bartender is super important. Well, one of the most important stakeholders to us is showcasing Spearhead to the bartender and getting them to understand what we're doing and hopefully start to play around and fall in love with Spearhead. So important. And actually, to the extent that if you look at how we design Spearhead, it's actually designed to live in the on-trade. So right up the top, we've got this apothecary style lip, so bartenders can pick up and pour from a speed well. Right down the bottom, we've got this Spearhead style punt. So when you put it on a back bar, and actually here with the light coming in, the light just bounces around the inside of the bottle and almost kind of, brings it to life. Couple that with the fact that it's in a bourbon shaped bottle. So, this is not a traditional Scotch bottle. It's not tall and round. It's square. It's got the ribbing, the embossing, the retro Americana almost look and feel on the front. So important for us in the on-trade. And I think testament to that is what's happening in the UK at the moment. So bourbon over the last, I think it's 3 or 4 years, has exploded in the UK. And that is down to the bartenders falling in love with bourbon in the UK. And that, I think that's just testament to, if you win the bartenders, it goes a long way in getting the messaging out, getting consumers to try it in different styles of cocktails, and then hopefully the off-trade will follow.
You talk about, look, the bottle, the design. Again, you think of everything down to the minute detail, which makes this even more interesting. The name Spearhead, where did that originate from?
Yeah, so Spearhead, the sentiment of Spearhead is spearheading a movement. So with what I was trying to do with the liquid is, it's thinking differently. It's the whiskey that does things differently, whether it's category and single grain, or whether it's just getting American, Irish whiskey drinkers into Scotch, or just anyone into Scotch. I wanted to kind of spearhead that movement of a Scotch that's really doing things differently. So I couldn't think of a better name than Spearhead, and luckily enough for us, it was available. So we ran with it.
As I continue to enjoy our conversation and enjoy this, really as this warms up, as the air hits it, there's such a wonderful brown sugar presence now, a spiciness, like just a baking spice, nutmeg and clove. You talk about, look, you can drink this neat, you can add some ice, as maybe we want to do. You talked about a couple cocktails, and you talked about this being bartender friendly. Talk about more of an expansive side of what's being created from Spearhead as you make this, that industry desirable product that people now have available that might be different from what they have to pour and make cocktails with.
Sure, yeah. So if you look at the style, and when I was looking at serve strategy at the start, I wanted to move away from what would be traditional or obvious for a Scotch brand or even a whiskey brand, right? So going to your stir down and brown, whether it's your old fashioned Manhattan, move away from that to the opposite end of the scale. And the opposite end of the scale is fun, unexpected, fruit forward. So where we started was, as I mentioned before, a Clover Club, right? You swap out the gin, swap in Spearhead, that sweeter style works really well. When we launched this in the UK, we ran a couple of competitions with bartenders, and instantly a ton of them started to pick out the exotic fruit note and went straight to tiki. So, if you put this in...
That's what I was thinking. Holy cow. Oh my God, that's crazy. Like fruit juices and exotic fruits, and that's crazy. Because
so
I'm drinking this, and it almost has some rum characteristic to it. And I know, and I'm thinking to myself, right now, Calum's got to have some of this sitting in a rum barrel somewhere, because the way you innovate.
We have some interesting stuff coming up. Let me share some of that with you in a minute.
All right, but talk about those cocktails. I don't mean to step on you, but It's like, wow, you're like, this is what I'm thinking right now too.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you put that in a Jungle Bird, for example, just with that slight touch of Campari for the bitterness, man, it works so well. So tiki, we've seen a lot with competitions, and down to, I don't know if you guys know Iron Brew. I think Scotland's the only market in the world where Iron Brew, which is a soda, a Scottish-based soda, sells more than Coca-Cola. So we had a ton of bartenders playing around with the they refined Iron Brew down and essentially made like a cordial and a tiki take with Iron Brew, which is crazy. All the way through to like, say, a spritz style. So, looking at a modifier like Peach Divine, peach-based liqueur, a little bit of ginger ale, double dash of orange bitters, some mint to finish it, and maybe a little bit of lemon juice. For the summer, I'm the biggest whiskey fan, biggest Scotch fan. I don't want to sit and drink Scotch dram by dram in the summer when it's warm outside, but if you put it in a spritz with that modifier, you change the occasion. And so you make Scotch whiskey more drinkable in the summer, which, is a great thing, because Scotch with the barbecue, you can't beat it. Right the way down to, your classic highballs, just with a little bit of soda. Or we talked about the spear and beer. Spear and beer was really a way of me trying to work out, how do we encourage people to drink Spearhead neat if they want to drink it neat and don't want to mix it? So it's that opposite end of the spectrum. Because I think a lot of the time when whiskey companies launch a new brand, they say it's the 100% malt whiskey made for mixing or something along those lines. And there's that perception that maybe the whiskey is, it can't be drank on its own because it's not as good and it has to be mixed. Actually, Spearhead, the liquid's phenomenal. So if people want to drink it neat, how do we recommend that? So if you partner that with a craft beer, whether it's a lager, an IPA, a stout, just literally, a 50 ml serve of Spearhead and a half pint, or 200, 300 ml of craft beer, it just works so well, and it's got a catchy name with the spear and a beer, which works out to be a good bar call.
All right, you wetted our whistle. You tempted us. I mean, look, here's what I always find: that you've got this wonderful child that you gave birth to, doing really well, getting straight A's. Everybody's like saying, this kid's going places, this Spearhead. But then everybody wants to say, are you having another child? What you talked about innovation. So what is the future? What are some of those things, if you can talk about some of them, that we can expect, from Spearhead?
Yeah, for sure. So the one frustrating thing with Scotch is you can't just make it and sell it, right? You can't just make it and bottle it. There's that aging maturation period. So a couple of years back, we started thinking about exploring different grains. And I mentioned before, single grain, it's probably the biggest challenge we have. Outside being a new to world brand, is that people often don't get what single grain means, and that's okay because we don't lead with category. But what single grain allows us to do is play around with different grain types. It doesn't have to be 100% malted barley like single malt or like our first release. What that does do is it gives it a premium characteristic, and actually within the world of single grain Scotch allows us to sit in the most premium space, where we're similar to, say, Nika coffee malt, for example, and less like a brand that is a Scotch brand that's maybe 90% wheat and 10% malted barley. But if you look at those grains and start to play around and explore grain, there is not at the moment an accessible by price and quality of liquid rye Scotch whiskey. It's a huge character in the States, right? With rye whiskey. Anytime I drink a Manhattan, I go straight for a rye whiskey. So I'm a big fan. And rye Manhattan is probably my favorite cocktail. So an accessible rye Scotch. Watch out for that one in a couple of years. We're playing around with unmalted barley, which is kind of cool. There's a concept for an Irish pot still style Scotch whiskey where we use unmalted barley, oats, malted barley, potentially some rye. So there's a ton of stuff that we're starting to play around with, which goes further than just finishing, but actually plays around with the liquid from the point of distillation, which is something I think we do really well, because at Loch Lomond we say 70% of the flavor comes from distillation, 30% from maturation. I think if you ask most distilleries, it's 30% distillation and 70% maturation. So we kind of flipped that and tried to distill that, pardon the pun, at the start. And then that leads on to a whole load of maturations. So watch out for some interesting infrared toast profiles coming, and there's a ton of stuff. So it's going to be exciting.
What is so much fun and so exciting for me as a consumer is I become introduced to Spearhead and I become a fan. I get to share this, and we get to see what's next. I mean, you're building a brand, you're building a fan base, and you're satisfying the masses. And it sounds to me like you've literally got the keys to the whole candy store, and nobody there at Loch Lomond has said this is off limits. It really sounds like they're saying, hey, Calum, you have carte blanche, whatever you want to play with, go play with. And that's great for me as a consumer. We're in the States. Where do people find you in the United States to get a hold of these bottles and start to enjoy making cocktails, sipping neat, introducing to friends?
Sure. So, hey, just quickly, that support, Michael Henry, our master blender, absolute genius. So I need to give a quick shout out to Michael. His name's on all the bottles, and he has been, with Spearhead. We've got a couple of new to world brands launching in blended malt, which is exciting. That's coming to the States as well. He's just a maverick genius. So to work with the team at Loch Lomond is a joy each and every day. In the States, you can get it bar cart. So we're 5 states so far. So we just launched in June, but we are New York, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, and California so far. So the focus for us is going to be just really making sure we get Spearhead out in those states, and then look into the next states that we can start to add. But at the moment, I think the best bet is Barcart.
I can't wait to come and see you directly in Scotland, see the distillery, Calum, and just look, your energy is infectious. Your passion, I can see this is like all the technology and the things that you did before led you to be able to share this passion, these talents with the world. And even, I see you on the video screen, your whole facial expression just beams when you start to talk about whiskey. And I know that you said that you've got this trip coming up where you're going to be doing the Bourbon Trail, which you've not done before. So you're just going to be introduced to some things that might now find its way into Spearhead down the road as you become even more creative.
I hope so. I'm excited. So I haven't done the Bourbon Trail before. It's going to be awesome. We're spending a couple of days in Nashville as well, and I'm going back to see some friends in Austin. So it's been a long time since I've been to a Longhorn football game, but I'm excited to go back. So it's going to be great.
Maybe Matthew McConaughey will be there. I don't know, right?
I hope so. We'll see.
This has been awesome. I wish we had more time, Calum. I know you have just so much going on for you, but is there anything you want the listeners to know about you or Spearhead before we just say sadly goodbye?
Hey, I'd just say if you're not a Scotch fan, start with Spearhead, give it a go. Don't be afraid to play around a little bit. There's so much in the world of Scotch. I'm a huge, on the American side, huge bourbon fan, huge American whiskey fan in general. I'm learning a ton. I'm still learning in Scotch. So I would say, just give it a go. There's so much to learn and discover and enjoy. So pick up a bottle and play around.
This has been a treat for me. Introduced to you in June. Couldn't wait to speak with you again. Thank you so much for being a friend of Fermented Adventure. We can't wait to spend more time with you, and we'll follow your journeys on Instagram. And are there social medias that people should be looking out for you and Spearhead on?
Yeah, for sure. So Spearhead is just at Spearhead Whisky, whiskey without the E. And I'm Calum Leslie on Instagram. So that's the best way to find me. Pretty
easy to find. Calum, thanks again so much for your time today. Thanks for sharing this and creating this wonderful spirit. Amazing if find a way to pick this up, because this is certainly something unlike anything you'll have. If you're not a Scotch whiskey drinker, this will turn you into one. If you are, this will make you, hey, you're on the right track. This is definitely something you want to have on your bar.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Rich. It's been an absolute pleasure.